The courthouse did not welcome. It stood as an edifice of stone and glass, its walls rising without warmth, its windows reflecting only the sky and not the people who passed beneath. The building was not designed to comfort, but to command, its marble floors polished to a sterile sheen, its ceilings so high that they made the individual feel reduced, measured, diminished. At the entrance, the ritual began. Shoes scuffed against the metal strip of the security scanner, belts pulled free, pockets emptied into grey trays that smelled faintly of sweat and steel. The guards behind the monitors scarcely looked up. Their attention was fixed on screens that rendered humanity as blurred silhouettes and outlines of metal. Each beep was a verdict, each nod an allowance. No words were exchanged unless required. The ID badge was the passport, worn at the chest, clipped to suit jackets or lanyards. It was the small square of plastic that separated those who belonged from those who waited. Those who moved with the badge walked differently, with a gait of entitlement, a rhythm of certainty. Those without shifted, glanced, hesitated at doors. The badge was not fabric and laminate. It was authority condensed, a symbol of silent borders. Michael Harrington walked with the badge. Black suit pressed, shoes polished to a muted shine, his posture measured. He had worn this badge for years, yet he knew each step on marble cost him more than it cost others. The echo of his soles did not blend with theirs. His walk drew eyes, subtle but unignorable. The receptionist's pause in her typing, the guard's glance lingering a beat too long, the whisper of clerks behind glass partitions. The hostility here did not speak. It watched. In the lobby, time stretched differently. People sat stiff on wooden benches, hands folded over knees, eyes darting to clocks and double doors. The air carried the weight of waiting. The courthouse was built to make people wait, for their name to be called, for their turn to stand before authority, for their fate to be measured against laws spoken in tones colder than the walls. Harrington did not sit. He stood with a folder tucked under his arm, its corners pressing into his side. Inside, the papers bore testimony, evidence, questions arranged with surgical care. He had read them 100 times. He would read them again before stepping into the chamber, though he knew the rhythm of his questioning by heart. Preparation was not for him alone. It was armor against the inevitability of resistance. The case was simple on paper, brutal in truth. Detective Rourke, years in uniform, commendations on file, accused of excessive force. The words in the file were antiseptic, unwarranted use of physical restraint. In the photographs, bruises darkened the skin of a man whose name did not matter to the system, except as complainant. Harrington had seen such files before, but each one carried the same cold calculation, the weight of the officer's badge against the silence of the victim. He adjusted his tie. His reflection caught briefly in the glass wall, sharp lines, steady eyes. The courthouse reflected him back with distortion, light bending across polished surfaces, never offering a whole picture. He thought of the hundreds of reflections he had seen here, all of them incomplete. An older bailiff passed by, his keys jangling in a slow, deliberate rhythm. He did not greet Harrington, though their paths crossed daily. Instead, his eyes dropped briefly to Harrington's badge before lifting away. Recognition of authority, but never welcome. The silence between them carried the weight of years, a practiced ritual of not acknowledging. The elevator doors opened with a hiss. Inside, fluorescent lights cast faces into pale imitations, stripping warmth from skin tones. The ride upward was always quiet. Strangers avoided each other's eyes. Each floor passed with a dull chime, a sound too sterile to carry emotion. Harrington watched the numbers climb. He felt the shift of air pressure, the tightening in his chest that came not from altitude, but from anticipation. The courtroom corridor was cold as still. Long lines of doors, each identical, each holding its own dramas, its own devastations. The carpet muted footsteps, but the silence was thicker here. Portraits of judges lined the walls, their painted eyes fixed forward, unmoving. The faces were pale, the robes black, the plaques beneath them etched in brass. The repetition of their features, square jaws, narrowed gazes, created an unbroken chain of authority, a lineage untouched by interruption. Harrington's footsteps carried him past these portraits, each step measured, each echo swallowed by the corridor's hush. His shoes marked him, not just as one who belonged here, but as one who was still marked by difference. He had walked these halls long enough to know that silence could carry contempt. He reached the door of Courtroom 3B. Its wood was heavy, its brass handle polished by countless hands. Above the frame, a small plaque bore the judge's name in etched letters, impersonal yet absolute. Harrington paused. The weight of the folder pressed against his ribs. He adjusted his grip. Inside, the room would be arranged as always. The judge elevated, the attorneys flanking their tables, the jury enclosed within its wooden box, the public benches behind. The architecture was not arbitrary. It was designed to remind each person where they stood in the hierarchy of law. Harrington had studied these arrangements for years. He knew they were not neutral. Space itself was an argument, and here the argument never favored him. A clerk passed behind him, clutching a stack of files. She glanced at him briefly, then quickly at the floor. The gesture was small, but it carried the entire weight of the day ahead. The avoidance, the refusal to meet his eyes, the silent insistence that his presence was anomaly. Intrusion. Harrington exhaled slowly. The marble beneath him reflected the weight of his stance, a faint sheen marking his shoes. He thought of the sound of those shoes, the echo of his first day here, the echo of every day since. Each step had carried resistance, though none had spoken it aloud. He reached for the handle. The door was cool under his palm, the brass indifferent to touch. For a moment he held still, listening to the muted shuffle of feet inside, the faint cough of someone waiting, the whisper of paper sliding across wood. The courthouse did not welcome. It tested, it measured, it waited, and Michael Harrington stepped forward, carrying both his badge and the weight that badge could never erase. The chamber was designed for control. Rows of benches pressed against the rear wall, polished wood stretching forward toward the raised dais where authority sat. Every angle, every elevation reinforced the hierarchy. The judge's bench stood high above, framed by flags and dark paneling. The witness stand sat boxed into the side, slightly lower, forcing the body within it to tilt upward. Even the jury box, walled in by railings, suggested confinement rather than participation. When Harrington entered, the hum of the room shifted. Heads turned slightly, eyes marking his path as though he were a disruption to routine. He walked the center aisle with the same deliberate pace as before, his shoes on wood softer now but still present. At his table, he placed the folder down with careful precision. Papers aligned, pen parallel to edge, posture upright. Small acts of order in a room built to resist him. Detective Rourke was already seated at the defense table, broad shoulders sunk low in his chair, arms stretched outward, fingers draped lazily across polished wood. He leaned back as though the trial were an inconvenience, a pause in his week rather than a threat to his career. A faint smirk clung to his lips, less expression than posture. His badge had been removed, but the entitlement of the badge lingered in his slouch, in the angle of his head tilted toward the ceiling, in the narrowed eyes that refused to acknowledge Harrington. The judge entered. Robes swaying, gavel in hand, the bailiff's voice called for order, though order had never been absent. Everyone rose, then sat, the motion practiced and automatic. The gavel struck once against wood, a hollow crack sharp enough to silence any stray coughs. It was the sound of authority condensed, the state's hand descending to remind all present who permitted them to speak. The first witness was called, a man whose voice carried hesitation even before he reached the stand. He raised his right hand, repeated the oath, then lowered himself into the chair. Harrington rose, buttoned his jacket, and began with questions calibrated to establish fact. His words were clear, measured, carefully paced. The answers stumbled, not because the facts were unclear, but because the weight of the room pressed on the man's throat. He shifted in his chair, eyes darting toward the jury, then back to Harrington, then down at his own hands. His voice was audible but fragile, as though one objection might break it. The defense attorney, a man of smooth voice and narrowed eyes, rose frequently. Objection, leading. Objection, speculation. Each word cut into Harrington's rhythm, slicing at his momentum. The judge did not hesitate. Gavel struck, objection sustained. The state's hand fell again and again, not neutral but precise, cutting Harrington's words short, while allowing the defense room to stretch. Harrington did not protest. He adjusted, reframed questions, slowed his cadence, found new paths. His restraint was deliberate, his posture rigid. But with each objection sustained, a subtle signal passed through the chamber. His voice could be interrupted, trimmed, contained. The jurors shifted in their seats. Some leaned forward slightly, brows furrowed in effort, as though trying to piece together fragments allowed past the objections. Others leaned back, arms crossed, their detachment sanctioned by the silence of the gavel. One woman glanced toward the clock, more often than toward the witness. The institution itself seemed to instruct them. Resist his voice, question his authority. Detective Rourke watched the performance with thinly veiled satisfaction. His posture was commentary. Reclining further, his head tilted, he tapped one finger lazily on the table's surface, the sound faint but deliberate. He smirked when the gavel cut Harrington off. A private smile widened just enough to register. His body language spoke what he dared not say, that this was not his trial. But Harrington's the next witness took the stand, a woman with clipped answers. Her eyes fixed on the judge rather than on Harrington. She paused too long before responding, as though waiting for permission. When Harrington pressed gently for detail, the defense rose again. Objection. The judge's gavel fell, and the silence that followed was louder than any words. The silence in the chamber was not absence, but presence. It grew heavy, layered. Clerks shifted papers unnecessarily, their eyes avoiding Harrington's table. A cough from the gallery broke through briefly, then was swallowed by quiet. Even the air vents seemed to hum more faintly, the entire room conspiring to diminish sound. Each time Harrington spoke, his voice met not only ears but the resistance of an architecture engineered to muffle. He stood straighter, resisting the pressure. His questions remained sharp, each syllable clipped, every pause intentional. Yet with every measured word, he felt the collective weight of a system pushing back. The gavel, the objections, the smirk of Rourke, the stillness of jurors, the downward glances of clerks. Together they formed a wall. The judge leaned forward once, eyes narrowing, gavel poised as though anticipating interruption. Harrington saw the motion, recognized the ritual. It was not impartiality. It was surveillance. The judge's body itself signaled resistance, a posture of readiness to restrain. Harrington's hands remained steady on the lectern. He knew the file within his folder more intimately than his own reflection. He had rehearsed each question, anticipated each turn. But rehearsal did not account for silence. Silence was not in the text. It was in the walls, in the posture of the accused, in the smirk that suggested immunity. Detective Rourke stretched, a long exhale through his nose, his body loose with arrogance. His slouch deepened, a slow collapse into the chair that communicated disdain more clearly than words could. The posture was a shield and a weapon, refusal to acknowledge, refusal to bend, refusal to stand accountable. His body performed protest against the very premise of judgment. Harrington's voice carried on, but the chamber seemed designed to thin it, to drain it of resonance. Each question struck like water on stone, precise, repeated, but absorbed, muted. The answers, halting and incomplete, dissolved before reaching the jury. The gavel hovered, ready, omnipresent. It was the state's hand, always descending, always curating which truths could be spoken and which must be cut short. Its wood was not merely wood. It was the weight of centuries, condensed into each crack against the bench. The silence that followed each strike was never neutral. It was complicit. When Harrington finally paused, the air itself seemed relieved. Papers shuffled. The defense leaned back satisfied, and the judge adjusted his robe with a faint tug at the sleeve. Rourke crossed his arms loosely, smirk intact, posture unchanged. The trial did not proceed as search for truth, but as performance of hierarchy. Each role rehearsed, each silence calibrated, each posture recorded, and through it all, Harrington's presence marked the fracture, his badge granting him entry. His voice permitted only by grace, his authority questioned with every echo. The silence was not absence. It was verdict. The air inside Courtroom 3B had thickened. The afternoon sun pushed through high windows, but its light landed weakly, flattened by the dark paneling of the walls. Dust floated in slow patterns, made visible by thin shafts of gold. Time had ceased to move at its natural pace. Each minute carried the density of hours. Harrington stood at the lectern, posture precise, tie aligned, hands steady against the wood. He read from his notes without glancing down, his voice deliberate, the rhythm controlled. He had reached the crucial seam in his questioning, the point where a single inconsistency could unravel the defendant's entire story. "Detective Rourke," he began, tone even, "in your report you state that the suspect resisted." Rourke interrupted with a shrug, eyes rolling upward. His body was not in dialogue with the court. It was in defiance of it. The smirk had returned, faint but unmistakable. He sat slouched, one leg stretched out under the table, his chair tilted back just enough to suggest leisure. Harrington continued. "And yet multiple witnesses describe the suspect's hands as visible, open, raised. How do you reconcile that?" A stir rippled through the gallery. A cough. A shift of weight on benches. The jury leaned forward, compelled by the tension between question and silence. Rourke gave none of them the courtesy of eye contact. His gaze fixed on the ceiling, jaw tightening, smirk dissolving into a clenched mouth. "Detective," Harrington pressed, voice calm but unyielding, "which account is true?" The pause that followed was not absence but collision. Rourke's body tightened in its slouch. The chair creaked faintly. The muscles in his jaw worked against restraint. His hands flexed on the table. The judge glanced down, robe shifting, gavel resting loosely in one hand. He did not speak. He waited. Rourke leaned forward suddenly, both palms flat on the table. His body lurched upward in a single sharp motion. The jurors inhaled audibly, as if bracing for collision. Harrington did not step back. His eyes fixed on Rourke, unblinking, steady. The sound arrived before the realization, the sharp crack of skin against skin, so loud it seemed amplified by the wood and stone of the chamber. Harrington's head turned slightly with the force of it, but his body remained immovable, his stance unchanged. The silence that followed was absolute. It was not the hush of ordinary proceedings. It was the silence of rupture, of something breaking that could not be mended. Gasps spread through the benches, some stifled, some open. A clerk's pen clattered to the floor. One juror's mouth fell open, lips trembling, but no sound emerged. Harrington straightened slowly, his head returning to center. The red mark on his cheek spread outward in the shape of a hand, vivid against his skin. He did not touch it. He did not flinch. His eyes locked once more on Rourke, steady, unshaken. Rourke's chest heaved. For a moment, triumph flared in his eyes, raw and unfiltered. Then it faded, quickly, visibly, replaced by the dawning recognition of what he had done, of where he had done it, of who had witnessed it. His smirk collapsed into a slack jaw. His hands trembled faintly above the table, unsure whether to clench or retreat. The judge's gavel struck once, twice, 3 times, but the sound did not restore order. It ricocheted against the silence, hollow, impotent. The authority it once embodied dissolved in the face of what had unfolded. Harrington remained still. His posture became more than composure. It became refusal. Refusal to be reduced. Refusal to respond in kind. Refusal to give the violence more than it had already taken. His silence towered above the act itself, heavier than retaliation. Every pair of eyes fixed on him, jurors, clerks, gallery, even the bailiffs frozen by shock. They watched the stillness, the refusal to collapse, the dignity that absorbed the blow without conceding humanity. The red mark burned, not as shame but as evidence. It was not personal alone. It was centuries condensed into flesh, visible proof of contempt laid bare in public. The slap was not new. It was ancient. But never before had this chamber heard it so clearly. Rourke shifted, his slouch gone, his posture broken. He sat forward hunched, as though shrinking into himself. His hands withdrew from the table, retreating to his lap. He avoided the eyes of the jury, avoided the steady gaze of Harrington. The silence endured. Seconds stretched unbearably long. No one moved to break it, not even the judge whose gavel had lost its meaning. At last Harrington inhaled. The sound was almost imperceptible, but it carried more weight than the gavel's strikes. He did not speak. He did not allow words to diminish the gravity of what had been laid bare. His stillness remained the final statement. The chamber had witnessed what it was built to conceal. That authority did not protect equally. That dignity could be assaulted in open daylight. That the hierarchy of this room was not merely symbolic, but violent. The silence was no longer absence. It was revelation. Chapter 4, The Immediate Reckoning. The chamber fractured. The judge's gavel came down in violent succession, 3, 4, 5 times, each strike a desperate attempt to resurrect authority. The sound was hollow now, stripped of its old command. Wood on wood echoed through the chamber, but no one believed in it anymore. Gasps surged from the gallery. A woman clutched her mouth with both hands, muffling a cry. Jurors shifted in their seats, some recoiling, others frozen in forward lean. The clerk dropped another pen, this one rolling across the floor with a faint, endless rattle that seemed louder than the gavel itself. The bailiffs, uniformed and armed, did not move. Their hands twitched at their belts, but hesitation anchored them in place. They had not rehearsed this moment. Their eyes flicked toward the judge, waiting for instruction, unwilling to act without permission. Detective Rourke sat motionless, the echo of his hand still trembling through the chamber. His confidence had evaporated in an instant. The smirk that had carried him through testimony was gone, replaced by pallor, sweat beading at his temples. His chest rose and fell too quickly, betraying panic. His gaze darted, to the jury, to the gallery, to the judge, to the bailiffs, as though searching for refuge. None appeared, and before him Harrington stood. The red mark on his cheek had deepened, blooming across his skin like a wound and a proclamation both. It was not silent. It spoke louder than any testimony, louder than any objection, louder than the impotent gavel. It was a living document, recorded in flesh, undeniable and unerasable. Harrington did not raise his hand to touch it. He did not bow his head. He did not speak. His silence became the center of the chamber, pulling all sound toward it. He stood straight, eyes fixed, posture unbroken. The refusal to collapse radiated outward, stronger than retaliation, stronger than outrage. Rourke began to shrink. His chair no longer seemed to hold him. He hunched forward, elbows tucked in, hands fidgeting in restless retreat. The man who had lounged with entitlement now looked small, reduced by his own hand. He knew the weight of what he had done. Not only the violence against Harrington, but the exposure of his contempt before the very system that had protected him. He had revealed too much. The defense attorney rose, stammering. "Your Honor—" The judge cut him short with another furious gavel strike. "Order!" he barked, but his voice carried desperation rather than command. The word rang out, brittle like glass about to shatter. No order came. The chamber had seen the truth, and the truth could not be ushered back into silence. The jurors shifted again, their discomfort spreading like contagion. One man clenched his jaw, his eyes hardening, while another woman pressed her palms flat against her knees, as though bracing herself against collapse. They were not neutral anymore. They had been forced to witness what neutrality concealed, the clerks whispered, their eyes darting between Harrington and the judge. Their hands fumbled with papers they no longer needed. The machinery of the court, pens, files, gavels, oaths, sputtered, exposed as hollow before the reality of what had transpired. Harrington's silence held them all. It accused without words. It demanded without motion. It turned every gaze inward, pressing the question no one dared to voice. What will you do now that you have seen? The judge's robe seemed to sag under its own weight. He shifted in his chair, eyes narrowing not in judgment but in unease. His gavel hovered mid-air, suspended between another strike and surrender. He had the power to command, but not the legitimacy to restore. The room no longer believed him. For the first time, the hierarchy inverted. Rourke, who had leaned back in smug entitlement, now leaned forward in collapse. The judge, elevated above all, sat diminished, robe heavy, gavel useless. The clerks and jurors, once passive, now carried the burden of complicity. And Harrington, silent, scarred, unbroken, stood as the only unshaken presence. The red mark glowed against his skin. It was not fading. It was deepening. Each second of silence made it sharper, brighter, more undeniable. It demanded recognition. It demanded reckoning, Rourke whispered, voice cracking. The word died in his throat. No apology could survive in the presence of that silence. The bailiffs exchanged glances. One shifted his weight forward, then back, caught between instinct and uncertainty. The chamber had paralyzed them as effectively as if their boots were nailed to the floor. No one moved. No one spoke. The gavel fell once more, weaker now, a tired echo. the weight of complicity pressed down on them all. Every second that passed without response was a second of silent alignment with violence. The institution itself stood trial, its symbols of order exposed as fragile ornamentation. Harrington finally drew a breath, slow, deliberate. The sound filled the chamber more fully than the gavel had. He did not speak. He did not need to. His silence carried the verdict already delivered by the mark on his face, by the posture of the man who had struck him, by the collapse of authority that followed. The chamber had witnessed not just an assault, but an unveiling. The system had slapped itself. The chamber did not recover. It lurched instead into chaos control mode, the choreography of a machine trying to reassert itself. The bailiffs finally moved, snapping from paralysis into motion. Their boots struck the floor with a heavy rhythm as they closed in on Detective Rourke. His body stiffened, then sagged as their hands gripped his arms. The badge he had once worn seemed to hang invisibly on him still, but now it offered no protection. His protests never fully formed. His lips parted, but the words tangled in his throat. The jurors were ushered out, their faces pale, their silence thick. The gallery erupted in whispers, fragments of shock leaking into the air. "Did you see? He struck right there in front of—" The murmurs trailed off as guards barked commands, restoring only the appearance of order. Rourke was led past Harrington. For the first time his eyes fell downward. The man who had lounged in defiance now hunched in submission, his shoulders caving inward, his steps heavy and uneven. He had become small in the presence of the very system he thought immovable. Harrington remained standing. He had not moved since the slap. His posture was still upright, his silence still unbroken. Only now, with Rourke removed and the chamber trembling, did he step forward. He turned toward the judge, the jury box now empty, the clerks frozen at their desks. His voice rose, not loud but steady, a controlled blade cutting through the residue of silence. This court has witnessed an act of violence. Not in an alley, not in the shadows, but here, in the chamber where justice claims to reside. His words carried neither tremor nor fury. They carried clarity. He paused. The red mark on his face flamed in the fluorescent light. He did not gesture to it. He let it speak for itself. "The hand that struck me was his," Harrington continued, "but the permission to strike came from here, from this room. From its silences, from its interruptions, from its protections extended and its protections denied." The judge shifted uncomfortably, robe rustling. His gavel lay still now, abandoned. Harrington's voice did not rise. It cut deeper by refusing to. "You may remove him. You may process him. You may sentence him, but you cannot claim this court is innocent. It is not." It stood with him until his hand betrayed it. The clerk stopped writing. The defense attorney's pen lay flat on the table, untouched. Every face bore the weight of accusation. Harrington let the silence return. He did not fill it with more words. His statement hung in the chamber like smoke, inescapable, seeping into wood and marble. Rourke was gone now, swallowed into the machine he had once served. The bailiffs would escort him through corridors, into holding cells, through paperwork and processing. His body would be moved by the very gears of justice he had once trusted to shield him. He had not merely lost control, he had been consumed. Harrington gathered his folder. He touched nothing else on the table, left no paper out of place. His movements were precise, almost ritualistic. He buttoned his jacket, adjusted his tie, and turned toward the door. The chamber watched him leave. His footsteps on the wooden floor sounded heavier than when he had entered. They were not rushed. They were deliberate, echoing against the silence. He passed through the corridor of portraits, rows of judges in black robes, faces pale, gazes unbroken. Their eyes had seen centuries pass without flinching. Yet tonight, their stillness felt more fragile, their authority less secure. The marble of the lobby greeted him again, the same polished surface that had echoed his steps that morning. Only now, each step seemed to resonate deeper, reverberating against the memory of what had transpired. The ID badge at his chest caught the artificial light, its plastic sheen reduced against the truth he carried in his bearing. Outside, night had fallen. The courthouse loomed in silhouette, its windows lit unevenly across the facade. Fluorescent lights glowed in offices where clerks filed reports, where security guards watched monitors, where administrators typed memos. The machine of justice did not sleep. It churned on indifferent, grinding cases into outcomes, processing bodies into numbers, reducing humanity into files. The courthouse was scarred now. The slap had reverberated through its chambers, burned into its marble, etched into its silence. But the machine had not stopped. It never stopped. It carried its wounds without changing. Harrington descended the courthouse steps. His shoes struck stone, the sound measured, unhurried. Each footfall echoed outward, past the security guards at the entrance, past the murmuring crowd gathered in fragments, past the city streets that stretched into darkness. He did not look back. He did not need to. The courthouse lights burned on behind him, bright, relentless, cold. They glowed as they always had, the machine of justice that never slept. That rarely awakened. And Michael Harrington walked forward, his footsteps heavy with meaning, carrying silence that could no longer be mistaken for consent.